She left at 18 with nothing. Years later, she returned to her grandfather's house and found a secret. The rain came down in sheets the night Eleanor Whitcombe left the village of Ashford-under-Hill, and nobody stood at the gate to watch her go. She was 18 years old, carrying a canvas hold-all that contained 2 jumpers, a photograph of her mother, a battered paperback on structural engineering, and 43 pounds in coins and crumpled notes. The bus to Bristol left at 11:15, and she had walked the 3 miles from her grandfather's house in the dark because there was no one to drive her, and because she could not bear to spend 1 more hour under that roof. Her grandfather, Arthur Whitcombe, had told her at supper that evening that she was no granddaughter of his. He had said it the way he said most things, quietly, without heat, as though stating a fact about the weather. "You've got your mother's foolishness in you. She ran off and disgraced this family, and you'll do the same. So go on. Go now and save us all the waiting." She had not cried. That was the thing people would remember about her later, those few who remembered her at all. The Whitcombe girl never cried. She had simply set down her fork, gone upstairs, packed her bag, and walked out into the rain. Behind her, the house sat dark against the hill, a great rambling stone manor called Thornfield Grange, 300 years old, with its sagging roof and its blind windows, and its secrets locked away in rooms nobody opened anymore. Eleanor did not look back at it. She told herself she would never see it again. She was wrong about that, but it would take 17 years to prove it. Let me tell you what they thought of Eleanor Whitcombe in Ashford-under-Hill, because it matters for everything that comes after. They thought she was strange. A quiet, watchful child who spent too much time alone, who took apart the broken grandfather clock in the hall and put it back together so it kept perfect time, who asked questions adults couldn't answer and then went and found the answers herself in the village library. Her mother, Catherine, had died when Eleanor was 9, a sudden illness, gone in a fortnight, and her father had never been in the picture at all. So she'd been raised, if you could call it that, by old Arthur Whitcombe, a man soured by grief and money troubles and a pride so vast it left no room for tenderness. The village decided early that the girl would come to nothing. She had no money, no connections, no father's name to open doors. When she won a place to study at a 6th-form college 2 counties away, Arthur refused to pay for the lodging, and she lost the place. When she taught herself enough mathematics to frighten the schoolmaster told her she was getting above herself. By the time she was 18, the whole village had agreed, in the comfortable way villages do, that Eleanor Whitcombe was a peculiar, prideful girl who would amount to nothing and probably deserved it. So when she vanished into the rain that night, nobody mourned. Nobody searched. Arthur told the neighbors she'd run off, just like her mother, and the neighbors nodded and said, "Wasn't it a shame?" And within a month it was as though she had never existed at all. This is the part everyone got wrong. 17 years later. The letter arrived at the offices of Marwick and Stone, structural consultants, on a gray Tuesday in March, and it sat in the in tray for 2 days before anyone thought to bring it up to the 11th floor. The 11th floor belonged to the principals, and the principal whose name appeared on the envelope was Dr. E. Whitcombe, Director of Structural Forensics. The letter was from a solicitor's firm in the market town of Pemberton, and it informed Dr. Whitcombe, with formal regret, that her grandfather Arthur Whitcombe of Thornfield Grange had died 11 weeks earlier, that probate had proven difficult, and that she was named, to the apparent surprise of everyone involved, as the sole beneficiary of his estate. Eleanor read the letter twice, standing at the window of an office that looked out over half of London. She was 35 now. The watchful, strange child had become a woman who moved through the world with a stillness that unsettled people who didn't know her. She had a reputation in her field that bordered on the legendary, the engineer they called in when a building was failing and nobody could understand why, the one who could stand in a cracking structure and read its death the way a doctor reads a pulse. She had testified in the inquiry into the Caraway Tower collapse. She had been the one to condemn the Hollandale Bridge 8 months before it would have killed 40 people, when every other consultant had signed off on it. She did not give interviews. She did not seek attention. She let the work speak. And now her grandfather, the man who had thrown her out into the rain, had left her everything. She set the letter down. Through the glass wall of her office she could see her assistant, a sharp young man named Tobias Finch, pretending not to watch her. She'd told him almost nothing about herself in the 3 years he'd worked for her. He knew she'd grown up in the West Country. He knew there was a place in her past she never spoke of. "Cancel my Thursday and Friday," she said when he put his head round the door. "Something's come up." "Anything I should?" "No," she said, "it's personal." She had not said that word in years. Personal. It tasted strange in her mouth, like a language she'd half forgotten. The drive to Ashford-under-Hill took 4 hours, and with every mile the years peeled away, until Eleanor felt the old tightness gathering in her chest, the particular dread of a place that had decided what you were before you'd had any say in it. The village hadn't changed. The same crooked high street, the same war memorial, the same green where she'd been pointed at and whispered about. She drove through it without stopping and took the lane up the hill, and there at the top, exactly as she'd left it, stood Thornfield Grange. It was worse than she remembered. The roof had collapsed in one wing. Ivy had swallowed the east face. The gardens her grandmother had once tended were a wilderness. The house stood there in the cold March light like a thing that had been dying for decades, and had finally, quietly succeeded. The solicitor, a careful man named Mr. Hartley, met her at the door with the keys and a great deal of nervous formality. He kept glancing at her as though he couldn't quite reconcile the famous Dr. Whitcombe with the village girl who'd run off in the night. Word had got around, of course. By the time she'd reached the solicitor's office that morning, half of Ashford knew that strange Eleanor Whitcombe had come back, and that she'd turned out to be somebody after all, and they didn't quite know what to do with that information. "It's a substantial property," Hartley said, fumbling with the great iron key. "Though I'm afraid your grandfather let it fall into considerable disrepair. The estate's debts are well. You'll want to see the figures. There's some question whether the house can be saved at all. Most of my colleagues would advise you to sell the land and let the place be demolished." "Most of your colleagues haven't seen it yet," Eleanor said. The door swung open onto darkness and the smell of damp and old wood and something else, something underneath, a mineral coldness she couldn't place. She stepped inside. And the house, which had stood silent for so long, seemed to draw a breath. She sent Hartley away. She wanted to be alone in it. The great hall was much as she remembered. The grandfather clock she'd once repaired now stopped and silent, the staircase rising into shadow, the portraits of dead Whitcombes glaring down from the walls. But she saw it now with different eyes. 17 years of reading, the bones of buildings had given her a sight ordinary people didn't have. And what she saw, as she moved through the cold rooms, was that something was wrong with Thornfield Grange. Not the obvious things, not the collapsed roof or the rotting floors. Those were just neglect. No, it was something in the structure itself. The way certain walls were thicker than they needed to be. The way the cellar stairs descended further than the house's footprint should allow. The way one corridor in the east wing simply ended in a blank wall, when the windows on the outside suggested rooms beyond it. Eleanor stood in that dead-end corridor for a long time, running her hand over the cold plaster, and she felt the old instinct stir, the one that had made her take apart the grandfather clock at 8 years old, the one that had built her whole career. Something here doesn't add up. Find out why. She found a crowbar in the ruined kitchen and went back to the wall. The plaster came away easily. It was newer than the rest, perhaps 50 years old, while the stone around it was 3 centuries. Behind the plaster was brick, and behind the brick she worked at it for an hour, sweating in the cold until a section gave way, Behind the brick was a door. A heavy oak door, banded with iron, with a lock that had not been opened in a very long time. Eleanor stood looking at it, her breath clouding in the dark, and felt her heart beating hard against her ribs. Her grandfather had bricked up a room. Why would a man brick up a room in his own house? She did not have the key, but Eleanor Whitcombe had never in her life been stopped by a lock. It took her until past midnight, working by torchlight, to get the door open. The lock was old and stubborn, but she'd taught herself the principles years ago, the way she'd taught herself everything, and finally the mechanism turned and the door groaned inward on hinges thick with rust. The room beyond was small, windowless, perfectly dry, sealed so completely that the air inside was decades old. And it was not empty. There was a desk, a chair, shelves lined with boxes and ledgers and rolled documents, and on the desk, laid out as though someone had only just stepped away, were papers covered in a precise, slanting hand she recognized at once. Her mother's hand. Eleanor sat down very slowly in the chair, and for a long moment she could not breathe at all. The papers were her mother's, letters, notebooks, drawings, and as Eleanor began with shaking hands to read them, the entire story of her life, everything she had believed, everything the village had believed, everything her grandfather had told her, began to come apart. Her mother had not been a foolish girl who'd run off and disgraced the family. Catherine Whitcombe had been a geologist. The notebooks told the story, page by careful page, and Eleanor read them through the night, the cold forgotten, the years falling away. Catherine Whitcombe had studied at university, something Arthur had always denied, insisting his daughter had been a flighty, useless thing. She had specialized in geology and mineralogy, and in the years before Eleanor was born, she had made a discovery that, if the notebooks were to be believed, was extraordinary. The hill on which Thornfield Grange stood, the whole ridge that ran beneath Ashford-under-Hill, sat atop a geological formation of staggering rarity. Catherine's surveys, her core samples, her painstaking analyses, all pointed to the same conclusion. Beneath the village lay one of the largest deposits in Europe of a rare earth mineral, a deposit whose value, in the modern world of electronics and green technology, would be almost beyond reckoning. And Catherine had told no one but her father. The letters explained why. Catherine had been afraid. She had understood what such a discovery would do to the village, the mining companies, the compulsory purchases, the destruction of everything and everyone she loved. She had wanted to find a way to protect Ashford, to control the discovery, to do it carefully and on her own terms. She had begged her father to help her keep the secret until she could work out how. And then Catherine had died. Eleanor read the last letters with her hands trembling. Her mother had been afraid, not of illness. In the final letter, dated 3 weeks before her death, Catherine had written, "Father, I am frightened. The Hartwell man came again today. He knows. I don't understand how he knows, but he does, and he will not stop. I am keeping the survey papers hidden. If anything should happen to me, the truth is in the place only Eleanor will think to look. She is only a child, but she is cleverer than all of us. One day she will understand. The place only Eleanor will think to look." Eleanor sat in the dead woman's chair, in the room her grandfather had bricked shut, and understood at last what her grandfather had spent 17 years doing. He had not thrown her out because she was worthless. He had thrown her out to keep her safe, to get her as far from Ashford and from the Hartwell man, and from this terrible secret as he possibly could. And he had been too proud or too frightened or too broken by his daughter's death to ever tell her so. He had let her hate him. To save her life, he had let her hate him for 17 years. This time, Eleanor Whitcombe did cry. She did not cry for long. That was not her way. By morning, she had gathered every document in the sealed room, packed them into the boot of her car, and begun to plan. Because there was a thread in her mother's letters that she could not let go of, a name that recurred again and again with growing fear. The Hartwell man. It did not take Eleanor long to find out who he was. A morning in the records office in Pemberton, an afternoon with the deeds and land registries her mother's notebooks had referenced, and the picture began to assemble itself with horrible clarity. The Hartwell in question was now Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, chairman of Hartwell Resources, one of the largest mining and minerals conglomerates in Britain. 35 years ago he had been a young, ambitious mining surveyor, the very man Catherine Whitcombe had in her innocence consulted for a second opinion on a soil sample before she understood what she had found. He had realized what she'd stumbled onto, and from that moment, according to her mother's increasingly frightened letters, he had wanted it. And now, Eleanor felt the cold settle into her as she read the planning notices in the local paper. Now Sir Geoffrey Hartwell had returned. Hartwell Resources had, over the past 2 years, quietly bought up land all around Ashford-under-Hill. They had applied for survey rights, and just last month they had lodged a planning application for an open-cast mine that would, if approved, swallow the entire village, the hill, and Thornfield Grange itself. The man who had frightened her mother to death, Eleanor was now certain that was what had happened, though she could not yet prove it, was about to seize the very thing her mother had died to protect. And the public inquiry into the planning application was scheduled for 6 weeks' time. Eleanor went back to London, but she did not go back to her old life. She told Tobias Finch she would be working remotely for the foreseeable future, and she set up an operation in a rented cottage on the edge of Ashford that ran, in the weeks that followed, with the quiet precision of a military campaign. She did not announce herself. She did not threaten anyone. She did what she had always done. She gathered the truth, piece by piece, and let it accumulate until it could not be denied. She had her mother's original survey data, the cores, the assays, the geological maps. But she knew that 35-year-old data from an amateur, however brilliant, would never stand against the might of Hartwell Resources at a public inquiry. So she did the work again. Using her own resources, her own reputation, and a small fortune of her own money, she commissioned fresh independent surveys, brought in geologists she trusted, and confirmed beyond any possible doubt that her mother had been right. But that was only the beginning, because the more Eleanor dug, the more she understood that the real story was not the mineral deposit at all. The real story was what Hartwell Resources had done to get its hands on it. The land purchases around Ashford had been made through a web of shell companies, at prices far below value, from villagers who had no idea what they were sitting on. Several of the sellers had been pressured. Eleanor found two who, once they trusted her, described threats, accidents, a barn that had burned, a well that had been poisoned. The planning application contained geological surveys that Eleanor, reading them with her expert's eye, could see had been deliberately falsified, not to hide the deposit, but to disguise something far more dangerous. Because the open-cast mine Hartwell proposed would cut directly into the ridge, and the ridge, as Eleanor's surveys now proved, was riven with ancient fault lines and underground watercourses. Mining it the way Hartwell intended would not just destroy the village. It would, within a few years, destabilize the entire hillside above the neighboring town of Graythorpe, population 11,000, and send it down in a landslide that would bury thousands of people. Hartwell's own geologists must have known. The falsified surveys proved they knew. They had chosen to hide it, because the cheap, fast, deadly method of extraction was the profitable one, and Sir Geoffrey Hartwell had decided that 11,000 lives in Graythorpe were an acceptable risk against a fortune of several billion pounds. Eleanor sat with that knowledge for a long time, and then she began, very quietly, to build the case that would destroy him. Word travels in small places. By the 5th week, Ashford-under-Hill knew that Eleanor Whitcombe was back, that she'd inherited the Grange, and that she was up to something with surveyors and lawyers. The village watched her with the old suspicion, sharpened now by a new uncertainty. Some of them remembered being unkind to her. Some of them had sold their land to Hartwell's shell companies, and were beginning to feel a creeping unease about what they'd done. It was the local schoolmistress, a kind-faced woman named Margaret Ellery, who finally came up to the Grange and knocked on the door. She had taught in the village school for 30 years. She had, she confessed, been a young teacher when Eleanor was a child, and she had stood by while the others called the girl strange, and she had never forgiven herself for it. "You were the cleverest child I ever saw," Margaret said, standing awkwardly in the cold hall. "And we all let your grandfather and the rest of them tell us you were nothing. I've thought about it for years. I'm sorry, Eleanor, for whatever that's worth." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "It's worth something," she said. "It's worth more than you know. Come in. There's something I need to tell you, and then I'm going to need your help." Because Eleanor had realized she could not do this alone. To stop Hartwell, she needed the village, the same village that had cast her out, to stand with her. And to win them, she would have to do the hardest thing of all. She would have to make them believe her. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell heard about the troublesome engineer in his 5th week of preparation for the inquiry, and at first he did not take her seriously. He was a vast, smooth, confident man of 70, who had spent his life flattening obstacles, and the news that some woman had inherited the derelict Grange and was asking questions struck him as a minor irritation, no more. He sent a representative, a polished young executive named Crispin Vale, to make Eleanor an offer for the Grange and the land beneath it. A generous offer, far above market value, the kind of offer that made problems disappear. Eleanor met Vale in the cold drawing-room of Thornfield Grange and listened to him in silence as he laid out the figures, the timeline, the discreet and generous terms. "It's a remarkable offer, Dr. Whitcombe," Vale finished. "Sir Geoffrey is keen to be a good neighbor. He understands the property has sentimental value, and he's prepared to be very fair." "My grandfather bricked up a room in this house," Eleanor said. "He kept it sealed for 17 years. Do you know what was in it?" Vale's smile flickered. "I'm afraid I don't follow." "My mother's survey papers," Eleanor said. "Catherine Whitcombe, I believe Sir Geoffrey knew her, a long time ago." She watched the name land. She watched Vale, who clearly knew nothing, go pale anyway, because some instinct told him he had walked into something far deeper than a property negotiation. "Tell Sir Geoffrey," Eleanor said quietly, "that I'm not selling, and tell him I know what's under the hill, all of it." She stood. "He'll understand what I mean." When the message reached Hartwell, he stopped laughing about the troublesome engineer. The strike, when it came, was exactly what Eleanor had expected, because men like Hartwell are predictable in their cruelty. First came the campaign to discredit her. Stories appeared in the regional press, questions about Dr. Whitcomb's mental stability, anonymous suggestions that grief over her grandfather's death had unbalanced her, hints that she was a fantasist with a grudge against a respected industrialist. A complaint was lodged with her professional body, alleging misconduct in a years-old case, a complaint Eleanor recognized at once as fabricated, but which would take months to clear. Then came the pressure on her allies. Margaret Ellery received a visit warning her that her teaching pension might be reviewed. The independent geologists Eleanor had hired began to receive threats, and 2 of them withdrew. Crispin Vale, who had grown uneasy and started quietly feeding Eleanor information, was found one morning to have been dismissed and discredited, his reputation in ruins. And then, 3 weeks before the inquiry, Thornfield Grange caught fire. Eleanor was not in it. She had, by then, learned to assume the worst and prepare for it, and she had moved the documents weeks before. But she stood on the hillside in the small hours watching the east wing burn, the wing with the sealed room, and she understood that she was now at war with a man who had killed her mother and would not hesitate to kill her. The fire investigators ruled it an accident. Old wiring. Eleanor knew better, and in the ashes the next morning she found her resolve had not weakened but hardened into something cold and absolute. He had burned her mother's house. He had tried to burn the truth. But the truth was not in the house anymore. The truth was in 11 bankers' boxes in a London vault, and in Eleanor Whitcombe's unbreakable mind, and it was coming for Sir Geoffrey Hartwell whether he liked it or not. She changed her strategy after the fire. She had been preparing to fight the inquiry on the narrow ground of the planning application. Now she understood that was not enough, that Hartwell would corrupt the process, lean on the inspectors, bury her in legal maneuvers until the village was gone. So she did something Hartwell would never have predicted, because it was the opposite of how powerful men think. She made it public, all of it at once. But she did it carefully. She did not go to the tabloids with wild claims. She assembled everything: her mother's original surveys, her own independent confirmation, the falsified Hartwell geological reports, the evidence of the Graythorpe landslide risk, the testimony of the pressured landowners, the web of shell companies, the pattern of accidents and threats stretching back 35 years. She had it all reviewed by the most respected geological authority in the country, an emeritus professor named Helena Castlane, who had once examined Eleanor's university thesis and had never forgotten the strange brilliance of the girl who wrote it. Professor Castlane reviewed the evidence for 2 weeks. And then she made a single phone call to a contact at the National Broadcasting Service, and she said the words that changed everything. "I have seen proof that a planned mining operation will kill 11,000 people, and that the company knows it. You need to send someone now." The story broke 9 days before the inquiry. The public inquiry into the Hartwell Resources planning application was held in the Assembly Hall in Pemberton, and it was meant to be a routine affair, a formality, with the outcome arranged in advance. Instead, on the morning it opened, the hall was packed to the walls. The press was 3 deep at the back, and a current of something electric ran through the crowd, because everyone now knew that the quiet woman from the Grange was going to stand up and accuse Sir Geoffrey Hartwell of murder. Hartwell sat at the front with his phalanx of lawyers, vast and unmoving, certain even now that he could not lose. He had the money. He had the connections. He had decades of being untouchable. He looked at Eleanor across the hall with something close to contempt, the same contempt the village had shown her 17 years before, the contempt of powerful people for a woman they have decided does not matter. He had made the same mistake everyone made. He had underestimated her. The inspector called Dr. Eleanor Whitcombe to give evidence, and she walked to the front of the hall, and she did not look nervous, and she did not look angry. She looked the way she always looked when she stood inside a failing building and read its death. She looked completely, terribly certain. She laid it out piece by piece in the calm, clear voice of a woman who has checked her facts 100 times. The geology, the deposit, the fault lines, the watercourses, the landslide that would bury Graythorpe. And the hall went utterly silent. The falsified surveys that proved Hartwell Resources had known about the landslide risk and hidden it. "This is fantasy," Hartwell's lead barrister said, rising. "This woman has a personal vendetta. There is no proof of any of it." "There is proof of all of it," Eleanor said, "and I have brought it with me." She turned to the projection screen behind her. What she showed them over the next 2 hours could not be denied, because Eleanor Whitcombe had spent her whole life learning how to make the truth undeniable. She showed Hartwell's own geological surveys side by side with the independent ones, and she showed, in language a child could follow, exactly where Hartwell's reports had been doctored, the data that had been deleted, the fault lines that had been erased from the maps, the water tables that had been falsely lowered. Professor Castlane took the stand and confirmed every word. 2 of Hartwell's own former employees, traced and persuaded by Eleanor over the preceding weeks, testified that they had been instructed to alter the surveys and had been paid to stay silent. And then Eleanor turned to the older crime. She told them about her mother. She read from Catherine Whitcombe's letters, the frightened letters, the Hartwell man who would not stop, the fear in the final pages. She showed the original survey from 35 years ago in her mother's careful hand, and the records proving that the young Jeffrey Hartwell had consulted on it, had known what it meant, and had spent the next 3 decades waiting to seize it. She did not accuse him outright of her mother's death. She had no proof of that, and Eleanor never claimed what she could not prove. But she laid the facts before the hall and let them speak, and the silence that followed was the silence of a room that has understood something monstrous. Through it all, Sir Geoffrey Hartwell sat unmoving, but Eleanor was watching him, and she saw the moment the certainty left his face. She saw the great smooth confidence crack, and beneath it, for just an instant, the fear of a man who has finally met something he cannot buy or burn or frighten away. "You knew," Eleanor said, turning to him directly, her voice still perfectly calm. "35 years ago you knew what was under this hill, and you wanted it, and you frightened my mother until—" She stopped and steadied herself. "And now you know your mine will kill 11,000 people in Graythorpe, and you decided their lives were worth less than your profit. You've spent your whole life certain that no one would ever stand in your way." She paused. "You were wrong about that. You were wrong about a great many things, the first being the day you decided that a young geologist and her strange little daughter didn't matter. The inquiry collapsed that afternoon, and the criminal investigation began within the week. It is the nature of men like Hartwell that when they finally fall, they fall all at once, because their power was built on the universal belief that they could not be touched, and once that belief breaks, everything breaks with it. The falsified surveys were referred to the prosecutors. The deaths and accidents in Ashford over 35 years were reopened. The pressured land sales were investigated for fraud and coercion. Hartwell Resources' share price collapsed, and the board, scrambling to save itself, turned on its chairman. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell was arrested 4 months later. The full reckoning would take years, the trials, the appeals, the slow grinding of justice. But he was finished from the moment Eleanor Whitcombe stood up in that hall, and he knew it, and so did everyone in the country who read the headlines the next morning. The proposed mine was scrapped. The Graythorpe landslide that would have buried 11,000 people would now never happen. And the rare earth deposit beneath Ashford-under-Hill, the thing Catherine Whitcombe had died to protect, was placed, at Eleanor's insistence, under a public trust, to be extracted slowly, safely, and lawfully if at all, with the proceeds held for the village and the region rather than for any private fortune. Catherine had wanted to protect Ashford. 17 years after her daughter walked out into the rain, her daughter had done it for her. Eleanor did not go back to London straight away. She stayed in Ashford through the spring, and she rebuilt Thornfield Grange, not as the cold, dead house of her childhood, but as something new. She restored the great hall and repaired the grandfather clock with her own hands, so that it kept perfect time again, and she opened the sealed room and turned it into what it should always have been, a small archive of her mother's work, preserved at last in the light. The village did not know at first how to face her. They had wronged her, and they knew it, and the knowledge sat heavily on them. It was the schoolmistress Margaret Ellery who finally organized it, a gathering in the village hall, the whole of Ashford-under-Hill crowded in, to say to Eleanor Whitcombe the thing they had owed her for 17 years. They did not make speeches. They were country people and not given to display. But one by one they came up to her, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had pointed, the ones who had agreed she was nothing, and they shook her hand and they looked her in the eye and they said they were sorry. And Eleanor, who had learned long ago to expect nothing from anyone, found that it mattered after all. That being seen, finally and truly, mattered more than she had let herself believe. An old man named Tom Peverley, who had been a friend of her grandfather's, was the last to come up. He was bent and shaking with age, and he held something out to her in his trembling hands. It was a letter sealed, with her name on it in Arthur Whitcombe's hand. "He gave it me 3 years ago," the old man said, "made me promise. Said if you ever came back, I was to give you this and not before. Said he hadn't the courage to say it to your face, the old fool. Said it was the only thing he was sorry for, in a long life of being sorry for nothing. Eleanor took the letter up to the Grange and read it alone, by the fire, in the house her grandfather had bricked shut to keep her safe. She never told anyone everything the letter said. Some things are too private even for a story. But she told Margaret Ellery the heart of it, weeks later, on a walk along the ridge with the whole green valley spread below them. Arthur Whitcombe had known what was under the hill. He had known what Hartwell was, and what Hartwell had done to his daughter, and what Hartwell would do to his granddaughter if she stayed. He had been a frightened, broken, proud old man, with no money and no power and no way to fight a giant, and the only weapon he had possessed was the ability to make Eleanor leave, to make her hate him enough to go far, far away and survive. So he had stood at the supper table and told her she was no granddaughter of his. He had watched her walk out into the rain, and he had spent the 17 years that followed reading every word she ever published, keeping a scrapbook of every bridge she condemned and every building she saved, watching from a distance as the strange little girl became the most brilliant structural engineer in the country, and saying nothing, because to reach out would have been to put her back in danger. I let you hate me, he had written, because it was the only love I had to give. I am sorry I never knew how to give you any other kind. You were always the best of us. You were always going to be the one to put it right. I knew you would find the room. I knew you would understand. Forgive me if you can. And if you cannot, then at least know the truth. You were never nothing. You were everything, the whole of it. You were the reason any of it was worth protecting at all. Margaret Ellery wiped her eyes. Eleanor did not. She had done her crying in the sealed room months before, and she had made her peace. He was wrong, you know, Margaret said, to do it that way, to let you carry all that hurt for so long. Yes, Eleanor said. He was wrong. She looked out over the valley her mother had loved, the valley she had saved. But he was right about the thing that mattered. He believed I'd come back and put it right, and I did. Here is what Eleanor Whitcombe understood in the end, standing on the ridge above the village that had cast her out and called her home again. The world is full of people who will tell you what you are before you have any say in the matter. They will look at a quiet, watchful girl with no money and no name and decide she is nothing, and they will be so certain of it that they will not even notice when she becomes everything they refuse to see. The village did it. Her grandfather did it in his terrible way. Sir Geoffrey Hartwell did it, all the way up to the moment she destroyed him. They were all wrong, and not because Eleanor proved them wrong with luck or with money or with some sudden stroke of fortune, but because she had spent every quiet, overlooked, underestimated year of her life becoming exactly the person who could not be stopped. The work she did in the dark, when no one was watching and no one believed in her, was the work that saved 11,000 lives. The strangeness they mocked was the brilliance they could not understand. The girl they threw out into the rain came back as the only person on earth who could read the death of a hillside and refuse to let it fall. People will underestimate you. They will judge you wrong, and they will do it with total confidence, and sometimes the ones who do it will be the very ones who love you most, in whatever broken way they know how. You cannot stop them. You cannot make them see what they have decided not to see. But you can do the work. Quietly, patiently, year after year, you can become so undeniably what you are that one day the truth stands up in a crowded hall and cannot be silenced, and every single person who looked at you and saw nothing finally understands what was in front of them the whole time. That is the only revenge worth having, not their humiliation, their understanding. The moment they finally see you true. Eleanor Whitcombe walked back down the hill to the house her family had bled to protect, and the grandfather clock in the great hall struck the hour, keeping perfect time, the way she had taught it to long ago, when she was a strange small girl that no one believed would ever amount to anything at all. She had amounted to everything. They had simply been looking in the wrong place all along.